figures, they're not small. How is it able to get this bad? And 60 years old is the best age, according to retire. This is according to a new survey. Did you retire at 60? Would you like to? Could you think of nothing worse? Email us at GBNews. We'll try and get through some of them. All that's to come, but first it's the news with Olivia.
Hello, this is your news at midday. Ghislaine Maxwell's family have launched an appeal after the British socialite was found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse girls. The 60-year-old has been convicted of 5 out of 6 charges in the US after a 3-week trial. Jurors found she lured young girls to be abused by Epstein between 1994 and 2004. Maxwell's sentencing date is yet to be confirmed, but it's thought she could spend the rest of her life in prison.
These 4 women were believed, and now Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted sex trafficker facing the rest of her life probably in prison because of the courage, the tremendous courage of these 4 women, and also the hard work of the police and the prosecutors and the attorneys who brought this case to justice.
The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs holding up to 100 patients each will start this week. The NHS is also ramping up the use of virtual wards at home, where patients get monitoring technology and regular check-ins with clinicians. Meanwhile, leading scientist Professor Peter Openshaw says a shortage of COVID tests is very worrying. On the same day that the UK reported more than 183,000 lab-confirmed cases, that's a new record, no PCR or lateral flow tests were available to order online. Professor Openshaw, who sits on the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group, is concerned the shortage could lead to people mixing at New Year without being able to test first. Officials are blaming exceptional demand and global supply issues for the problem. Well, nurses who are exhausted and overwhelmed by the pandemic are regularly working 12-hour shifts to keep the NHS afloat. A Royal College of Nursing survey of 9,000 staff has found that 74% regularly work beyond their shifts, mostly unpaid. The poll was carried out in October before Omicron hit. Many are unhappy with the quality of care they can provide due to inadequate staffing, and 60% are thinking of quitting. Joyce Pinfield, the Vice Chairman of the National Care Association, says the workforce are struggling.
We are totally exhausted, totally overwhelmed by the amount of work that we are doing. A lot of it is because of the shortage of workforce. NHS has a tremendous shortage of workforce, as does social care. So to try and have all of these extra burdens that have been put on by the pandemic, it's just unsustainable.
The Liverpool women's hospital bomber died from the explosion and fire caused by the improvised device he manufactured with murderous intent, a coroner has ruled. Iraqi-born Ahmad al-Swayalmeen was killed when the bomb he made went off with him inside the taxi. The driver, David Perry, survived the blast. The bombing came shortly before 11 a.m. on Remembrance Sunday. The coroner said it remained unclear as to whether he intended for the device to detonate when it did. From January, insurers will no longer be able to charge existing customers more to renew than they would new customers. It follows a review by the Financial Conduct Authority that found many insurers were increasing prices for renewing customers in a practice known as price walking. It's expected to save consumers £4.2 billion over the next 10 years. Campaigners are warning major changes to the highway code, which put more responsibility on drivers to look out for cyclists and pedestrians, are not being promoted enough. Charity Cycling UK says the changes, which come into force next month, need a long-term and well-funded campaign to make people aware of the updates. The new measures will introduce a risk-based hierarchy of road users. The average UK house price is now 16% higher than before the pandemic. The typical price of a home reached a record high of almost £255,000 in December. That's an increase of just under £24,000 in a year. The Nationwide Building Society says it's the biggest increase ever recorded in a single year. Wales saw the greatest increase, with house prices up on average by 15.8%. That's your news update. I'll be back in half an hour with the latest headlines. Now let's return to Colin.
I do apologise. You had to wait a bit longer than you normally would do there. Some technical gremlins that have been revisiting us again over the Christmas period. Anyway, here we go. The former American president, George W. Bush, who was responsible for ordering the so-called War on Terror, as well as deploying troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, has admitted that he knew very little about international affairs. This is something we know because official documents released from the archives today reveal that President Bush, who at the time was the governor of Texas, made his admission to the former British ambassador to the United States, Sir Christopher Mayor, in February of 1998, prior to the Republicans' presidential run. President Bush said he knew little about Prime Minister Tony Blair or his new Labour project, but the seeds of the Blair-Bush political love-in were sown during that 1998 visit, Bush telling Sir Christopher that he thought Blair seemed like a pretty good chap. Sir Christopher Mayor, who represented our country in the United States from 1997 to 2003, technology permitting, joins us now. Sir Christopher, thanks ever so much for your time today. Do appreciate it. Were you surprised by this very frank admission? It suggests he was quite parochial in his outlook, which is a surprise in some respects, because you think about his father, Bush Sr., who'd been a former boss of the CIA. You would imagine he would have picked up a sense of how the world worked from Dad.
Well, I was more surprised by the frankness of his admission than by the admission itself. I'm not at all surprised to hear that a governor of Texas didn't know much about the wider world. I'm not at all surprised that somebody who eventually became president of the United States, and that was 3 years later after this meeting, didn't know anything really significant about the world at that time. And I have to say that a year later, when I returned to Texas to see Governor George W. Bush again, he had by then just about decided to declare his run for the presidency and had created a kind of brains trust of mighty experts on foreign policy to give him teachings on the various issues around the world. And I should also say that, what am I talking about here? 3 years later, when Tony Blair paid his first visit to the United States to meet George W. Bush as president at Camp David, the president's retreat, George W. Bush seemed pretty well versed in issues dealing, for example, with the Middle East and Russia. So looking at this in hindsight, surprise is not really, I think, my first reaction.
That brains trust that you mentioned, I suppose it would have been populated by people like Dick Cheney and the late Donald Rumsfeld. And there are those who say he was a sort of ideologically captured by the neocons. But, it wasn't just people like that he surrounded himself with. There were people like Condoleezza Rice, who was an expert on the Soviet Union.
I never thought he was a neocon. I mean, sorry, I've interrupted you there, but I've never thought he was a neocon. And in fact, he actually said to me that he wasn't a neocon. And the people he appointed to head this brains trust, which was known as the Vulcans, was one who was ideological, a chap called Paul Wolfowitz, who became the Deputy Secretary for Defence. He was a true blue neocon, I can put it like that. And the other was the supreme pragmatist Condoleezza Rice, who was to become his national security advisor in his first administration and then Secretary of State in his second administration. So this Brains Trust is not a bunch of sort of screaming neocon evangelist nutters. They were a mixture of people with very firm beliefs about America's destiny in the world and with a lot of practical experience of how you manage international relations and foreign affairs.
As you look back now, and we think back to the early noughties, and he became this slightly sort of panto villain, George W., didn't he? And I suppose in light of what came next, for some people, they'll look at him and say, actually, he had quite a grasp on foreign affairs compared to what followed. He's become an elder statesman of sorts now, hasn't he? Are you surprised by that?
No, I'm not, because I have to say, when I first met him, I was enormously impressed by him. And I had my wife with me, and she is a far better judge of people than I am. And she, too, was enormously impressed by him. By as much as his character, if you like, but that's not too patronizing a thing to say, as by what he told us as matters of fact. An absolute willingness to admit to what he didn't know as well as to what he did know. A very shrewd grasp of retail politics. But what he learned from his father was less international relations, but how to campaign. Because his father, George H.W. Bush, had been involved in all kinds of campaigns, not only nationally, but in the state of Texas. And George W. went along with him to help. And he learnt vast amounts from that, which is why when it came to the presidential election of 2000, when he was running against Al Gore, who had been Bill Clinton's vice president, who was the favorite to win that election, in the end, although it was a narrow squeak, it was George W. who won because he campaigned so much better than Al Gore did.
I was in Washington, I think it was 2004, for the second inauguration, and it was, as you looked back at his first term, it was impossible to rid yourself of that sense that here was somebody whose presidency had been necessarily shaped, inevitably shaped by this titanic foreign affairs tragedy. I was going to call it an incident, tragedy in the form of 9/11. And he had to learn very quickly.
Well, the presidency is a brutal school of domestic and international relations. Even if you think you've got your experience, you get into the Oval Office, a bit like going to Downing Street, and it hits you like no other place in the United States. And I think that those of us who are very quick to criticize him for deciding to go into Iraq and take Tony Blair with him, if you like, always forget I try to find the right word. Traumatic is used too easily nowadays, but it was the traumatic impact on him and his administration of 9/11. And this notion that he came into the presidency with, that it was America's destiny. I mean, so many other presidents think the same way. It was America's destiny to spread democratic values of freedom and liberty, and essentially American values around the world. All that stuff was supercharged, turbocharged by 9/11 and his reaction to it. That he, in effect, became, if you like, God's instrument to rid the world of terrorism and the threat to democracy. And that, I think, was the most important factor in his deciding to invade Iraq in 2003. And Tony Blair found it extremely persuasive as well, as we all know.
Well, it's a fascinating subject. I'm sorry we haven't got more time to go through some of it. So, Christopher Mayer, thanks so much for your time today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Colin.
A story that's related to this. Should Afghanistan get millions of British taxpayer pounds now that the Taliban have ejected Western forces? Many people will think that the limits of British interference in that war-torn country have been more than reached, but they do not include the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He says Afghanistan represents the, quote, biggest humanitarian crisis of our times, requiring the global action that should be global action to stop the country's economic and social collapse. Mr. Brown said more than half of the Afghan population was facing extreme hunger, including 1 million children who are at risk of starving to death. Well, let's turn to Dr. Alan Mendoza, the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, the transatlantic foreign policy and national security think tank, who joins me. Alan, thanks for your time. There will be people listening to the words of Gordon Brown and wringing their hands really and saying, yes, it's an awful condition that this poor, benighted, embattled country finds itself in, but the West has done everything it can to create the stable conditions where prosperity and stability might flourish, but ultimately we weren't needed, and in a sense the consequences that follow from that can't be laid at our door, or can they?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Colin, isn't it? I mean, the nature of how we withdrew was seemingly not a concern about what would happen thereafter, suggests in a moment that we do have some responsibility for what follows. That doesn't mean you're there forever. That doesn't mean you have to necessarily do what Gordon Brown has suggested. But part of the reason the withdrawal was so disastrous, I think, was because these questions were simply not addressed and nobody thought what might happen the day after that withdrawal. And so, to a certain extent, it'll be interesting to see what exactly the architect of the withdrawal, President Biden, intends to do now.
I mean, again, there'll be people saying, well, there's lots of other parts of the world where we should be spending the hard-won British taxpayers' pounds. This isn't necessarily one of them, but I know those people, and they include people like Richard Dannett, the former head of the British Army, who told me a couple of months ago why he was advocating as strongly as he was for a return to the 0.7% of GDP foreign aid budget in the UK, something which isn't very popular if you poll the general public. And he said, well, look, you have to spend the money in places like Afghanistan, because if you don't, chaos ensues, it becomes a breeding ground for terror, and that ends up on British streets.
Yes, I mean, the part of what we were, I think, what the government wanted to do when it actually decoupled DFID and put it back into the Foreign Office was to try and make decisions like this and to say, actually, what we need to look at are the broader strategic objectives of British foreign policy. And as a result, we need to look at places where if we put money in, we can prevent the kind of instability that then leads to foreign policy redresses afterwards. So I think there is a lot of truth in what General Dannett has said in the sense of decisions made in development terms do have a longer term impact on foreign policy decision making. But then again, you balance that against the reality that when you come to Afghanistan, you're essentially therefore propping up a terrible vile regime like the Taliban.
That's exactly the phrase, isn't it? I mean, that's the problem here. You would be propping up the Taliban. You'd be feeding people they ought to be feeding, creating jobs they ought to be creating, allowing them to focus on their other objectives, which will include destabilising countries like ours.
Yes, and therein lies the problem. Therein lies your challenge. What is actually better for British foreign policy? Is it pump money in the hope that this will pacify the Taliban and leave them to kind of develop in the way that they wish to domestically, which, of course, by the way, is very antithetical to what we would want to see in terms of any countries we were supporting with aid. So let's not forget that side as well. Or secondly, not pumping the money in and then seeing what reacts there. But part of this argument is always going to be, is it not? The Taliban are in charge. They clearly had a reservoir of support among the Afghan people, and we should leave them to get on with it. Here's a very difficult choice. You've got people's lives at stake, obviously, but you have to therefore also think what might happen a year down the line if you either support the Taliban or don't support the Taliban. And those questions will have to be addressed, I think, at the highest level.
Alan Mendoza is the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Coming up, teachers in Scotland are receiving compensation, quite a lot of it actually, for assaults and other injuries sustained at school. We're talking about that after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there. As we approach a New Year's Eve, things look decidedly mild. Wet for some and a fair amount of cloud, but today we've seen some favoured spots seeing some brighter weather. But this weather front straddles more central parts of the country, moving slowly northwards, bringing with it some high rainfall totals as we head into a New Year's Eve. And you can see it's rather windy across many parts of the country. So through Thursday evening and overnight, you can see this rain moving up towards northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts to come. And we will see the highest rainfall totals for the Lake District, as well as Dumfries and Galloway. Further south, more rain returns to Wales as well as the West Country. By dawn tomorrow, we'll be across central southern England, pushing quite quickly towards the southeast, as well as the Midlands and East Anglia. It's a mild night, leading into a mild start to New Year's Eve. Through the day then tomorrow, we'll see this rain just stall across central and southern parts of Scotland, as well as northern England. It will dry up across Northern Ireland, even some brighter skies further south across England and Wales, as well as the far northeast of Scotland. And even where we see this rain, it will fade as we head through into evening time. So if you are stepping out through a New Year's Eve evening, it's worth noting the winds will pick up further strength, particularly towards the west. It'll be mostly dry, perhaps some drizzly bits and pieces over the southern uplands as well as Pennine districts, before more rain arrives through the latter part of the night across northern England as well as Scotland. And again, that will push through quite quickly with that strong wind. It will be an exceptionally mild start to 2022. But we will again see some showers move in from the west, brighter skies ahead of it, and again that keen breeze with gales across western facing coasts. All in all, temperatures will hold up in double figures away from the north. But as we head into Sunday, things turn very windy in the south and colder from the north. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
You're watching GB News live across the UK, the world, and our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We're here for you. Don't forget to join our community by hitting the subscribe button.
And download the GB News app so you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
Reported today that teachers in Scotland received over £160,000 in compensation claims for assaults and other injuries at school this year. The biggest payout for one teacher, £38,777 after they suffered serious injuries after being assaulted in class. The names of the schools and indeed the teachers involved were, as you'd expect, perhaps not made public. Well, I'm joined by Michael Mara, Scottish Labour's Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills in Scotland. Michael, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. All to be clear, this figure isn't, we presume, all about assaults and people being attacked by pupils. This is injuries at work, so that could include, for instance, a PE teacher sustaining an injury whilst on the playing field. Nonetheless, there's an assumption here that there is some classroom violence behind some of this.
Yeah, there certainly is. There's no doubt about that. It is a mix of some compensation paid to teachers for accidents, health and safety at work, people trips and falls, badly maintained equipment, etc. So, but there is obviously a content of this where teachers have been assaulted, which is totally unacceptable that people go to their work and suffer violence. So, this highlights a real issue of discipline in schools, and this is a resource issue as well, of course. Very large classroom sizes, a lack of teachers, and over the last 14 years, we've seen a marked decline in the number of teachers in Scotland's schools, which has, I think, led to this kind of situation that we see these things happening.
This is going to sound like a very odd question, but I think it's an appropriate one. Can we be absolutely certain it was not ever thus? Big class sizes, sad to say, they come and go, and it depends on where you are, but they've been a factor of life for quite a long time. There's no suggestion that children have suddenly become much more prone to acts of violence than once was the case. I know there'll be some people tutting and say, well, back in my day, when teachers administered discipline at the point of a cane, things were very different. But what's missing here is that control group that allows us to look at data from 30, 50 years ago that would allow us to say with conviction, it's worse.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that, it's not a case of just purely about a resource issue, and it's not a case of we live in a much worse society than we used to. I just don't believe that that's the case. I am being told by teachers across Scotland in recent months that there are real concerns at the moment about, in the kind of post-COVID environment, kids back in school as full time. There's a lot of young people who are finding it really difficult to readjust to classroom situations. So there's teachers who are telling me that incidents of violence are on the rise, ill discipline, so more minor level stuff, because these are relatively isolated incidents in terms of assaults that are then being compensated in the way that we're talking about. But I think there's a general issue at the moment about returning to classrooms and making sure that you can have discipline in the schools that everyone's suffering from as a result of COVID, and the need to make sure that we can resource that appropriately. I think we're just beginning to actually touch the idea of what the impact of COVID has been in our classrooms, in our schools, in terms of lost attainment, but also the lack of socialisation for kids. And as I say, for many of them, particularly ones in key transition phases between primary school and secondary school, have lost out on the idea of what it is to learn in this kind of environments. So, there's a lot of work to do there. I'm not suggesting that those kids are being violent, but I do think there's an issue of discipline, an issue of creating the kind of the environment for learning, and a lot more needs to be done to make sure that we can recover appropriately from the pandemic at the moment.
There's no question that they sometimes are. maybe sometimes is better. The better word is often. And I'm looking at statistics from England, Michael. The Teachers Union there reporting that one in five teachers in England and Wales have been physically assaulted by pupils this year. So not in the course of their career, but this year. Clearly that's a big spectrum, a minor assault to something potentially quite serious. There will be viewers listening to us and saying, this is what happens when you allow the minor things to go by the board. If you don't clamp down on basic discipline, you create a culture in which serious disciplinary problems can then thrive all the way up to violence and assault against teachers.
Yeah, I think that's fair as well. We need to ensure that that kind of general, and that's what I'm trying to kind of to bring out here, the issue about classroom control, discipline, making sure that you've got appropriate resources in place, that teachers have the support they need. we've also got a situation where we're going to have to recruit more teachers in the coming years across the whole of the UK to make good on the lost education that we've had in recent years through COVID and the impact of that. We can't afford to have a lost generation in terms of education. And actually, it's stories like this coming out in instances which are based in fact that aren't going to allow us to attract people into the profession. So we have to actually support teachers. So I think it's right that the trade unions are taking the action that they are to actually claim for compensation to try and put to make sure that they can receive some recompense for their members, but also to try and create a better situation where more people can come into the profession, because that's what we're going to need.
Michael Marrett is an MSP with Scottish Labour. Michael, thanks for your time this lunchtime. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
Coming up, 60 is it really the best age to be when you want to retire or actually do retire? That's according to a new survey. But can we actually afford to do so? We're going to be looking into that more. But first, here are the news headlines with Olivia.
Thank you, Colin. Here are the latest headlines. Ghislaine Maxwell's family have launched an appeal after the British socialite was found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse girls. The 60-year-old has been convicted of 5 out of 6 charges in the US after a 3-week trial. Jurors found she lured young girls to be abused by Epstein between 1994 and 2004. The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs, holding up to 100 patients each, will start this week. Further sites could also be identified to add a further 4,000 super surge beds. The Liverpool women's hospital bomber died from the explosion and fire caused by the improvised device he made with murderous intent, a coroner has ruled. Iraqi-born Ahmad al-Swayalmeen was killed when his bomb went off with him inside the taxi. The driver, David Perry, survived the blast. The coroner said it remained unclear as to whether he intended for the device to detonate when it did. The average UK house price is now 16% higher than before the pandemic. The typical price of a home reached a record high of almost £255,000 in December. That's an increase of just under £24,000 in a year. The Nationwide Building Society says it's the biggest increase ever recorded in a single year. Wales saw the greatest increase, with house prices up on average by 15.8%. You're right up to date. I'll be back with more on today's news stories at the top of the hour.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. I just heard, didn't we, about record rises in the housing market. 16% since the start of the pandemic. The prices of houses have risen in the UK, and mortgages for up to 7 times a person's salary are going to be offered for the first time since Northern Rock was nationalised in 2008. All that went with that around the subprime crisis. Since that financial crisis, banks have largely only lent up to 4 times someone's overall income. But now there's an online lender, it's called Habito. It says it will lend up to £1.5 million to would-be borrowers if they are able to put down that deposit of 10% of the overall purchase price. The decision, however, as you can appreciate, has raised fears of people taking on huge debts they ultimately can't pay, no matter how long they work for. Darren Small is senior partner at Edge, independent mortgage brokers in London, joins us now. Darren, thanks ever so much for your time. Do appreciate it.
Hi.
Does this concern you? Are we repeating some of the mistakes from the mid-noughties?
At this stage, no, I wouldn't say it would concern me too much. I think we've got a lender here who is trying to balance that gap between, as you showed, the property price increase, which is outstripped the income growth. So this is just another tool, I think, for people maybe to get on the housing ladder. I think it does need to be balanced with a degree of affordability, and you would hope that the lender is going to maintain those degrees of making sure someone can afford this mortgage, not just now, but going forward in the future as well. I think one of the key things about this 7 times income multiple is that the interest rate's going to be fixed for a long period of time. So rather than someone just being able to afford it now, over the first few years, those interest repayments aren't going to change throughout the life of their mortgage. That maybe gives them that degree of protection. But I think you're right in what you say. I think we need to make sure we avoid going back to the bad old days where money was too easy to be lent and that people ultimately can afford their mortgage.
Well, the bad old days too of not knowing with absolute certainty or any reasonable certainty where interest rates will be. Speculation inflation could reach 6% next year. Just had the first interest rate rise, which feeds into mortgage rates, obviously, for ages recently. That absolute conviction that people have had that low mortgage rates are here almost in perpetuity. That's not true anymore, is it?
No, you're right. And I think one needs to be cautious with this. This lender, Habito, isn't the first one that's gone past, as you mentioned, say the 4 times income multiple. It's been quite common on the market for some of the high street lenders to lend up to 5.5 times income. You had a lender a few months back went up to 6 times income as well. I think maybe the key difference with this Habito mortgage is that you are in many ways protected against interest rate rises because the interest that is going to be set day one will remain throughout the entire lifetime of the mortgage, really. Now, the flip side of that coin is that starting interest rate is considerably higher. So there's a big price to pay for that protection, for that lifetime rate, which is unusual in the UK. But if you're someone that needs to kind of stretch those multiples as far as 7 times, as you say, you've maybe got the protection there, the safety net there, that the interest rate and your repayments aren't going to alter.
Darren, do you find yourself increasingly having to remind some of your clients, perhaps your younger clients, that the housing market is not a one-way bet?
Yeah, very much so. And I think you're right in what you say there with regards to, say, those first-time buyers. Quite a lot of those guys have been used to rates. They think the norm is rates in the 1%, 2%, 3%. They've never even seen rates probably as high as 5%. So making sure that they can afford it not just now but in the future. Everything looks rosy at the moment with rates on the market at sub 2%, even as low as the low ones. But making sure someone can afford the mortgage in the longer term is a key part for any broker, and I'd say for any lender as well. That's one of the key things they're looking at. Not just that you can afford it now, but you can afford this in the longer term.
Yeah, though that may sometimes require working for most of your working life to pay off a mortgage, mightn't it? Darren Small, thanks very much indeed, Dan. On that subject, apparently 60 is the ideal age to retire, a whole 6 years earlier than the current state pension age. State pension age, of course, is going to go up depending on when you were born. Why do, it seems, many of us, a quarter of us, want to retire before we're supposed to, if there is such a thing here as supposed to? According to a study of 2,000 British adults who have taken early retirement or plan to, it found that more than a third wanted to enjoy the freedom of being unemployed, well, not necessarily employed is probably a better way of putting it, while still being healthy and fit enough to enjoy it. There's the key thing. Other factors, though, include stress, spending more time with family. But can we actually afford to retire this early? Depends who you are, doesn't it, what your circumstances are. Let's turn to Tom McPhail of the financial services consultancy, The Lang Cat. Tom, thanks for your time, appreciate it. Obviously, individual circumstances vary massively, don't they? But it's an interesting aspiration, and that balance for many people will be, yes, if I can afford it, take it soon enough to actually still be hale and fit and able to fully enjoy retirement healthily.
Yeah, I absolutely sympathise. I empathise with that aspiration, and I think if you reach state pension age, mid-60s now, you typically got a life expectancy for men of about 20 years, for women a little bit longer, sort of 20, maybe 22, 23 years. That's the average. But you're not going to be strong and healthy for all of that life expectancy. So you've got that healthy life expectancy period through your mid-late 60s into your 70s, when you can still do stuff. You can travel. Hopefully, you can make the most of life. And why would you not want to extend that period and to really celebrate and enjoy that period from age 60 onwards, when you're doing all the things you've always wanted to do but been too busy earning money or bringing up children to do it? So that's great, but you've got to pay for it. And that's where it gets a bit more challenging. And most people will not be able to afford to retire at 60 unless they make some really tough and deliberate choices to make that happen.
Point about the health and the extent to which people can really enjoy retirement. I mean, I'm looking at that state pension age, obviously 66 at the moment. If you're born after 1960, you can take it from 67 years of age. If you're born after 77, then 68. The argument when some of that was being discussed was that actually if you've been in a really punishing physical job, this idea that's popular now that actually you can keep working as long as you like, perhaps a couple of days a week here and there, help, working in a superstore, whatever it might be. But actually if you've done something physical, labouring on a building site for 40, 50 years, the physical capacity you might have to enjoy retirement at 68 may be quite limited, actually.
You're absolutely right. And it's also important to bear in mind that typically around half of people's income in retirement comes from the state pension, comes from the state. And then there's another big chunk that's typically made up of workplace pensions. So if you don't have that workplace pension, then you're going to need some serious other savings. But that state pension doesn't kick in until your mid, increasingly late 60s as we go through time. So if you want to retire at 60, for at least that first few years, you're going to be living off money that you've saved, either in investments and in ISAs or in pensions. And that's going to have to do all the work for you. And that state pension of £10,000 to £15,000 a year if you're an individual or a couple, that makes up a really big chunk of your retirement income from your mid-late 60s onwards. That's not available to you early on. So that's why you're going to have to do some really serious saving to make that happen. If you want to retire at 60, good luck to you, but it won't happen by accident.
Yeah, and it's based on a number of assumptions, Tom, isn't it? I mean, for instance, just had a conversation a moment ago talking about the fact that inflation could hit 6% next year. And we know that inflation, it punishes pensioners particularly because they have a fixed income that they can't alter.
So the state pension will keep rising, not precisely in line with inflation, but in fact the increases in recent years have been very generous, in fact almost too generous in some ways. Your pension income may increase, but not all of it will. If you've just got your money invested in the building society, I say invested, really, it's just stored in the building society, that is definitely not going to keep pace with inflation. So the other really interesting challenge for people in retirement is you kind of need to keep your money invested in stocks and shares, and there's volatility risk that comes with that, and the values will go up and down. Over time, it should even out and it should give you a good return. But managing that and knowing how much you can draw from that pot of money and how long it's got to last for is not simple. And then maybe you've got some housing wealth in there as well, and you might want to draw on that housing wealth. Interestingly, a lot of people think that they'll downsize when it comes to it. Most people generally don't want to. We should be using more equity release than we do. Most people really balk at the idea of taking capital out of their house, but that's going to have to become an important tool as we go forward over the next 20 years as well.
When do you plan to retire, Tom?
I've already dropped to 4 days a week, and that makes me very happy. I don't want to stop working, but I want to work how and when I want to.
Lovely answer. Good for you. Tom McPhail, appreciate your time. Thanks a lot. Well, for those lucky retirees finally having the time to put on a record, you are actually in the majority of music listeners, according to new figures. Streaming on music online or purchasing CDs, not good enough for many music enthusiasts. We know this, don't we, who are turning to vinyl records. In some numbers, in fact, over 2.1 million vinyl albums were sold last week. That'd be right, last week? Making it the biggest vinyl sales week since 1991. Taylor Swift, Adele, Billie Eilish all had their albums printed on vinyl, with the latter selling some 73,000 records of her latest album in its first week. Back to the future, indeed. Some are hoping this may provide some relief for the, well, hard-hit music industry that's been punished by COVID, particularly, obviously, live music. Well, joining me, Gennaro Castaldo of the Record Labels Association, the BPI. Gennaro, thanks so much for joining us today. It's
pleasure.
This would have been unthinkable for those of us who'd consigned vinyl to the great dump of the music dump of history 10, 15 years ago. There's a tactile element to this. There's an audio quality element to it as well. Things like sleeve art, cover art play a part as well. But these figures are really extraordinary.
They are, yes. So the figure for this year is likely to be about 5.3 million. So that's the 14th consecutive year of growth since the low point in 2007. So really, people have sort of taken vinyl back to their hearts. And it's not just the baby boomers that obviously grew up with it, but equally a younger generation of millennials and Generation Z fans that I think see its appeal. And as you've said, it's tactile. There's a kind of warmth to the sound. There's all the sort of sleeve notes and the art that goes with it. And really, you should see the vinyl album as a form of art. I know that artists absolutely love to release on that format, as they still do on CD and even cassette, and of course through streaming as well. So from a fan point of view, we've never had more choice in terms of how we can discover and enjoy and collect the music that we love, and the same for artists as well. It's been enabled, I think, by this explosion of British creativity. We can be so proud of our heritage. Actually, is the world's largest exporter of music after the US, and so much of this, along with the artist talent, has been fueled by record labels who just consistently invest in new talent, in new music, and in sort of trying to present the products in the most desirable way possible. And certainly, if you look at a nice piece of vinyl now, it's weighty, it has real substance, it's very desirable, aspirational, and people have been buying record players as well, so they can really enjoy the experience, immerse themselves in it. And that's the great thing about vinyl. It's very interactive, unlike streaming where you're playing different songs and playlists and so on. With vinyl, you have to put it on, you have to sort of flip it over halfway through once it ends that first side and so on. So it really brings you in as a fan. And I think fans also love the whole experience of going into their local independent shops or chains such as HMV and kind of browsing for their favourites, or just buying online, as so many now have had to do over the past couple of years. And it's remarkable, as you say, we've had 2 years of pandemic nearly, and yet sales keep going up, nearly 10% we think this year. So something remarkable is happening, and people just love the idea of it.
Yeah, and they love the idea. They love the object of art, don't they? I think of a couple of my teenage daughters. They just have vinyl in the sleeves on their walls. It's become wall art for them. For other people, you talk about turning the record over. That's like, there's a ritualistic element, I think, for some people, isn't there? Can I just take an alternative view on this, if possible? It's kind of what we're here for. I suppose there'll be some people who have misgivings, having gone the whole hog to digital, which, okay, produces maybe a tinnier sound, but it doesn't produce any plastic at the end of it. There's no record that needs to be physically disposed of. I mean, okay, you'll say people hang on to them, and I'm sure that's to a great degree true, but not always.
No, I mean, that's an important fact. And actually, just recently, our members, record label members, announced a plan to decarbonise the industry, because we recognise, like every other sector, that we have a responsibility to be carbon neutral, not just in the packaging, but in the product themselves. I should say about 80+% of all our music consumption in the UK is actually now through streaming. But of course, that also has a footprint, because we use the all the electricity and the servers that sort of actually enable it. So we're looking very closely at all of that. But when it comes to vinyl, you're right. It's essentially a petroleum-based product, but I think people would want to collect and own it. They don't see it as something that they would wish to dispose, although we can ensure that the packaging that comes with it is certainly made from recycled products or is recyclable in the long run as well. So that's a responsibility we have. But fundamentally, I think people just aspire to own the product and own and collect it for many years to come, and probably pass it on to the next generation as well.
In a word, Gennaro, is this peak vinyl? Can it go any higher? Very briefly.
Well, we keep thinking that it won't, but it always seems to. So I think there's a bit more to come. But CD is still doing well, cassettes, and of course we're streaming as well. So it's the best of all worlds for fans and artists.
Gennaro Castaldo, appreciate your time this lunchtime. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Coming up, Scotland is home to the world's first Bitcoin rehab centre for those suffering from excessive Bitcoin trading. We'll be speaking with a crypto expert on whether he would agree trading needs to be treated. That's after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there. As we approach a New Year's Eve, things look decidedly mild, wet for some, and a fair amount of cloud. But today we've seen some favoured spots, seeing summer brighter weather. But this weather front straddles more central parts of the country, moving slowly northwards, bringing with it some high rainfall totals as we head into a New Year's Eve. And you can see it's rather windy across many parts of the country. So through Thursday evening and overnight, you can see this rain moving up towards northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts to come, and we will see the highest rainfall totals for the Lake District, as well as Dumfries and Galloway. Further south, more rain returns to Wales as well as the West Country. By dawn tomorrow, it will be across central southern England, pushing quite quickly towards the southeast, as well as the Midlands and East Anglia. It's a mild night, leading into a mild start to New Year's Eve. Through the day then tomorrow, we'll see this rain just stall across central and southern parts of Scotland as well as northern England. It will dry up across Northern Ireland, even some brighter skies further south across England and Wales as well as the far northeast of Scotland. And even where we see this rain, it will fade as we head through into evening time. So if you are stepping out through a New Year's Eve evening, it's worth noting the winds will pick up further strength, particularly towards the west. It'll be mostly dry, perhaps some drizzly bits and pieces over the southern uplands as well as Pennine districts before more rain arrives through the latter part of the night across northern England as well as Scotland. And again, that will push through quite quickly with that strong wind. It will be an exceptionally mild start to 2022. But we will again see some showers move in from the west, brighter skies ahead of it, and again that keen breeze with gales across western facing coasts. All in all, temperatures will hold up in double figures away from the north. But as we head into Sunday, things turn very windy in the south and colder from the north. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News. You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Hi there, very good afternoon and welcome. It's Colin Brazier with you through until 2 today. Here's what's coming up in the next hour or so. Nearly 100 terrorists are being considered for release back into British society before completing their entire prison sentence. A national security advisor, former one, will give me his thoughts about whether that's a particularly good idea. Scotland's home to the first rehab centre that treats cryptocurrency traders for their addiction. Is it an addiction? A Bitcoin expert, the man who wrote the book, will discuss that one. Also, our Northern Ireland reporter, Dougie Beattie, gives us the latest on Northern Irish COVID restrictions in schools. And the billionaire Elon Musk being accused of taking up too much space in space as more of his satellites are launched into orbit. The Chinese Communist Party is not very chuffed. A space expert, Andrew Land, will talk that through. All that's to come, but first, the rest of the news with Olivia.
Hello, this is your news at 1 o'clock. Ghislaine Maxwell's family have launched an appeal after the British socialite was found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse girls. The 60-year-old has been convicted of 5 out of 6 charges in the US after a 3-week trial. Jurors found she lured young girls to be abused by Epstein between 1994 and 2004. Maxwell's sentencing date is yet to be confirmed, but it's thought she could spend the rest of her life in prison. But a lawyer for some of her accusers says she faces very much time in jail.
These 4 women were believed, and now Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted sex trafficker facing the rest of her life probably in prison because of the courage, the tremendous courage of these 4 women, and also the hard work of the police and the prosecutors and the attorneys who brought this case to justice.
The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs holding up to 100 patients each will start this week. The NHS is also ramping up the use of virtual wards at home, where patients get monitoring technology and regular check-ins with clinicians. Meanwhile, leading scientist Professor Peter Openshaw says a shortage of COVID tests is very worrying. On the same day that the UK reported more than 183,000 lab-confirmed cases, that's a new record, no PCR or lateral flow tests were available to order online. Professor Openshaw, who sits on the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group, is concerned the shortage could lead to people mixing at New Year without being able to test first. Officials are blaming exceptional demand and global supply issues for the problem. Well, nurses who are exhausted and overwhelmed by the pandemic are regularly working 12-hour shifts to keep the NHS afloat. A Royal College of Nursing survey of 9,000 staff has found that 74% regularly work beyond their shifts, mostly unpaid. The poll was carried out in October before Omicron hit. Many are unhappy with the quality of care they can provide due to inadequate staffing, and 60% are thinking of quitting. Joyce Pinfield, the vice chairman of the National Care Association, says the workforce are struggling.
We are totally exhausted, totally overwhelmed by the amount of work that we are doing. A lot of it is because of the shortage of workforce. NHS has a tremendous shortage of workforce, as does social care. So to try and have all of these extra burdens that have been put on by the pandemic, it's just unsustainable.
The Liverpool women's hospital bomber died from the explosion and fire caused by the improvised device he manufactured with murderous intent. That's what a coroner has ruled. Iraqi-born Ahmed al-Swaylamin was killed when the bomb he made went off with him inside the taxi. The driver, David Perry, survived the blast. The bombing came shortly before 11 a.m. on Remembrance Sunday. The coroner said it remained unclear as to whether he intended for the device to detonate when it did. From January, insurers will no longer be able to charge existing customers more to renew than they would new customers. It follows a review by the Financial Conduct Authority that found many insurers were increasing prices for renewing customers in a practice known as price walking. It's expected to save consumers £4.2 billion over the next 10 years. Campaigners are warning major changes to the highway code, which put more responsibility on drivers to look out for cyclists and pedestrians, are not being promoted enough. Charity Cycling UK says the changes, which come into force next month, need a long-term and well-funded campaign to make people aware of the updates. The new measures will introduce a risk-based hierarchy of road users. And the average UK house price is now 16% higher than before the pandemic. The typical price of a home reached a record high of almost £255,000 in December. That's an increase of just under £24,000 in a year. The Nationwide Building Society says it's the biggest increase ever recorded in a single year. Wales saw the greatest increase, with house prices up on average by 15.8%. That's your news update. I'll be back in half an hour with the latest headlines. Back to Colin.
Story that you would appreciate is dominating the newspapers this morning. Some of them first 6, 7 to 8 pages about this story. Ghislaine Maxwell found guilty of recruiting and trafficking girls to be sexually abused by the late American financier Jeffrey Epstein. The 6-year-old was found guilty on 5 of the 6 counts that she faced, including the most serious charge, that was of sex trafficking a minor. The verdict was reached after 5 days of deliberation by a 12-person jury in New York. Los Angeles attorney Lisa Bloom represents some of Epstein's victims, told GB News she welcomed the verdict.
It's hard to put into words. I mean, imagine the most humiliating, awful experiences of your life and then having to go in front of a room full of strangers after having to talk to law enforcement and prosecutors and lawyers about over and over and over. And then you have to go in and testify. And then you have to be subjected to cross-examination. And well, you said it a little bit differently 2 years ago, and now you're saying it this way. Well, you had a drug addiction problem. Well, you had a sexual issue. Over and over again, just these brutal, painful questions, but they endured it. They were very brave. And I want everybody out there to know, because I represent many victims of sexual abuse now against high-profile predators, that you do not have to be perfect. You can have made mistakes in your life, as we all have. You can even have told the story differently in the past before you were ready to tell the full version later. It's okay. You can still be believed. And these 4 women were believed. And now Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted sex trafficker facing the rest of her life probably in prison because of the courage, the tremendous courage of these 4 women, and also the hard work of the police and the prosecutors and the attorneys who brought this case to justice.
Moving on, 92 convicted terrorists are being considered for release from prison by the parole board. These inmates, often participants in plots that failed only through the intervention of our security services. Terror offenders must now serve 2/3 of their sentence before being eligible for release, a change that's been in place since 2019. Those are some of those who may be eligible for parole as early as this spring. Let's turn to Sir Mark Lisle-Grant, former UK ambassador to the United Nations and indeed a former national security advisor as well. Sir Mark, thanks ever so much for joining us. Appreciate your time this lunchtime.
Good afternoon, Colin.
Why are we expecting such what feels like almost a glut of inmates to be presented before the parole board, and can they cope with all of them?
Well, I think this is a sign, actually, that the new system is working, because before the legislation that you mentioned that was introduced in February 2020, some of these terrorists would have already been released automatically after serving only half of their sentence. But over the last 2 years, they now have to serve at least 2/3 of their sentence and then could be eligible to have a hearing before the parole board. So I don't think it's surprising that there are a number in the pipeline. Over the last 4 years, there have been about between 200 and 250 convicted terrorists in British jails at any one time. And that number has remained largely constant over that period. The large majority of those are Islamist terrorists, although there is a rising number of right-wing extremists in prison as well. And over the last 2 years, since this new legislation has passed, about 110 to 115 of those have been presented before the parole board. But of those, only 11, so less than 10%, have actually been released. The rest have either been sent back to prison or are waiting for their hearings to be heard.
So they're certainly not being rushed through the gates, that's for sure. It's such a difficult determination for the parole boards to make. I mean, the easy response is to say, throw away the key. Rates of recidivism are notoriously high when it comes to people who have an ideology which celebrates martyrdom and actually encourages a certain degree of duplicity, which might help them persuade a parole board that they've actually turned the corner and rehabilitated. So there will be those people who say, why take the risk? These are people who wanted to kill as many of us as possible, leave them to rot in prison. There's a contrary view which says, actually, this isn't just necessarily about being charitable. This is about finding people who we can use, in a sense, as propaganda instruments, people who demonstrate that it is possible, actually, to reject a certain ideology and come out the other side.
Yes, that is an absolutely legitimate debate, and one has to distinguish a little bit between these categories of terrorists, because not all of them have been convicted for the same sentence, for the same seriousness of offence. There are some who are given what's called an indeterminate life sentence, which means that they will never be eligible for parole. So it doesn't matter how long they have served, they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. So in a sense, the key is being thrown away. But the majority are not in that category and will be eligible for an assessment by the parole board after 2/3 of their sentence. But that parole board, specifically for these terrorist offences, is comprised of some real experts, former judges, former policemen, prison officers, etc. Those who have a great deal of experience, and they have the ability to hear information, intelligence from the intelligence agencies about the individuals. So it's an extremely rigorous process. We're talking of a small number of the total number of prisoners that go before the parole board, after all. Something like 16,000 cases go to the parole board every year, and only about 100 of those are maybe terrorist offences. But the terrorist ones will be treated extremely rigorously. And even in the rare cases where they are released after 2/3 of their sentence, there will be both monitoring and possibly restrictions on their freedom of movement. So, for instance, there could be electronic tagging. They could be banned from use of the internet in certain circumstances, restricted on where they go and who they see. And there is a monitoring system by the law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So it's a pretty rigorous process. And I don't think the public should be concerned that this number of people is potentially going towards the parole board this year or next year.
Yeah, and those figures that you outlined for us, who make up the parole boards, I mean, in a sense, they're on a hiding to nothing, because we don't hear about it when things go right, do we? It's only when something goes wrong, somebody's released early on parole and they commit another offence, that people turn around and say, why on earth were they released?
Yes, and unfortunately, there have been cases where people have been on parole and have recommitted terrorist offences, and that's one of the reasons. There was the famous case Osman Khan, who the London Bridge attack, who was actually out on parole and was, in theory, attending a rehabilitation program and carried out a terrorist attack. And it was partly that case that triggered the new legislation to make it even more difficult for terrorists to be released early. There will always be the risk of individuals getting through the system in that way. But equally, there are, as you rightly say, Colin, a large number of people who are released who are not recidivists, who do not recommit offences, and that actually potentially could even be helpful to the law enforcement agencies in the future.
Yeah, in lots of different ways. So Mark Lyle-Grant, thanks ever so much for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Now, Scotland is home to the world's first rehabilitation centre that treats cryptocurrency addiction. Castle Craig, it's a private hospital in Peeblesshire that has admitted patients who've gambled away, in some instances, millions, whilst trading Bitcoin. It's the form of cryptocurrency, one of several, actually, one of many, which is not currently regulated, at least not in England. The clinic is overseen by senior therapist Tony Marini, who says he's the first physician to recognise the similarities between crypto trading and gambling.
Cryptocurrency has been so volatile, going up and down very quickly. Myself being a compulsive gambler as well, really get that buzz, get that excitement through the crypto curve, as we call it, the up and down. But it's very, very quick. They were talking about the crack cocaine of gambling being the FOBs and the gambling and the establishments there. Well, this is even quicker than that. So the highs and the lows are very quick. So, yeah, it's just like trading, But what's happening now is that, with there being over 3,500 different cryptocurrencies, people are swapping from one to another very quickly. And it's that fantasy, that fantasizing about getting that big win.
Let's turn to Dominic Frisby, author of Bitcoin, The Future of Money, and indeed a good friend to this channel who joins us now. Dominic, hi to you.
Morning, Colin.
Is this going to be of any use, do you think, weaning people off? Do people need to be weaned off Bitcoin?
Well, I don't think people need to be weaned off Bitcoin. I think they need to be weaned on Bitcoin. But what that gentleman was describing there and what that centre is doing is treating people who are speculating in cryptocurrencies, owning Bitcoin and just sitting on it and not trading it, and trading in and out of, altcoins and other cryptocurrencies are two very different habits. And, there's a big crossover between gambling and, speculating in penny stocks, trading stocks. You look at all the problems with spread betting and IG, and, there's in that Venn diagram, there's a lot of crossover between that and speculating in altcoins. And they all give you a little bit of dopamine or whatever it is when the trade goes your way, and then you get very depressed when trades don't go your way. Because of the extraordinary amount of money that can be earned speculating in altcoins, in cryptocurrencies, they attract a lot of people. They sell the big dream of riches and Lamborghinis and all those things that we all want. And so, yeah, you look at the most famous speculator that ever lived, Jesse Livermore, famously shorted the stock markets in 1929, the most brilliant trader ever. Books have been written about him, reminiscences of a stock operator. He was a manic depressive, and he had a terrible problem with his addiction to trading and ended up committing suicide. So it's not confined to cryptocurrencies. This is part of something much bigger.
And bigger, but older still. Get rich quick schemes, speculative bubbles are as old as the hills, pretty much. Was the South Sea bubble, 300? No, maybe not quite so long ago, but a long time. And that idea that there's people see a friend, tap their nose and say, I've got a good thing for you. That's just now magnified online, isn't it? That the chatter, the rumour mill is so much quicker. It reaches so much further now because we're able to talk to people on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think, get-rich-quick schemes have probably been around as long as money's been around. There was probably some get-rich-quick scheme in ancient Babylon that's documented somewhere. I don't know, but it probably existed. But I would say something about bubbles and the South. People often compare Bitcoin to tulips. We need bubbles. Bubbles, you look at the tulip bubble, it was in 1630, whatever it was, 400 years ago. Here we are in 2021. Holland remains the financial centre of the world for flowers. It's the centre of the global flower industry. So that tulip bubble built, bubbles accelerate infrastructure. Without the dot-com bubble, we wouldn't have had all the internet, the cables wouldn't have been laid. Without the railway bubbles, the tracks wouldn't have been laid.
Yeah,
so bubbles accelerate investment.
Yeah, but there's a bit of, not much, I'm not a great flower lover, but there's a bit of utility in a tulip. A pleasing aroma, something nice to look at on your dining table. Bitcoin?
Are you seriously suggesting there's no utility to Bitcoin, Colin?
No,
I do hope you're not, because you're going to be on the wrong side of the argument.
As a physical object is what I'm saying, as something you derive pleasure
It's not a
from.
physical object, it's digital. All the wealth in the world is now digital. The physical economy grows at 2, 3, 4% per year. The digital economy is where all the growth is, the internet. There's no bounds. Look at, NASDAQ.com, the most valuable companies in the world. They're all digital. Amazon, Apple, Google. Don't criticize something because it doesn't exist. The digital economy
I'm a believer.
is where the
I read
wealth
your
is
book.
made.
I was persuaded by your book.
I know.
Just on things like, but on the things you can look at, on the digital art, the non-fungible tokens, all that stuff. I mean, do you see a parallel with that? People getting into again things which, I mean, that is something you can enjoy, isn't it? That is again, it's intangible, but it's something you can look at and derive some utility from.
Colin, listen, sorry, I didn't mean to have a go at you. I forgot that you read my book, and you did tell me, and I do apologise. I've just got a very short...
Bought it and read it.
Well,
bought it with old-fashioned cash, Dominic.
I get very sort of aggressive. Listen, it's a whole new economy. It's a whole new technology, NFTs and so on. There's loads of BS to it, for sure, but it is also the future. It's one of these weird things. It's a speculative bubble. Everyone's exploring. They're trying out the new technology. Nobody quite knows where the value is. And so, but, people are paying £1 million for NFTs. So somebody must see them. As long as the buyer and seller agree on a price, then what's the problem? So I agree that a lot of this speculation is going to amount to nothing. But at the same time, it is also the future.
Good subject, isn't it? Dominic, lovely talking to you. Thanks a lot.
You too.
Coming up, the billionaire tech entrepreneur, another one. Elon Musk has been criticised for the satellites, the orbit of his satellites, the Chinese Communist Party, not very happy. Some claim they're taking up too much space in space. Andy Lound will give us his analysis on that story after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there. As we approach a New Year's Eve, things look decidedly mild, wet for some, and a fair amount of cloud. But today we've seen some favoured spots, seeing summer brighter weather. But this weather front straddles more central parts of the country, moving slowly northwards, bringing with it some high rainfall totals as we head into a New Year's Eve. And you can see it's rather windy across many parts of the country. So through Thursday evening and overnight, you can see this rain moving up towards northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts to come, and we will see the highest rainfall totals for the Lake District, as well as Dumfries and Galloway. Further south, more rain returns to Wales as well as the West Country. By dawn tomorrow, will be across central southern England, pushing quite quickly towards the southeast, as well as the Midlands and East Anglia. It's a mild night, leading into a mild start to New Year's Eve. Through the day then tomorrow, we'll see this rain just stall across central and southern parts of Scotland as well as northern England. It will dry up across Northern Ireland, even some brighter skies further south across England and Wales as well as the far northeast of Scotland. And even where we see this rain, it will fade as we head through into evening time. So if you are stepping out through a New Year's Eve evening, it's worth noting the winds will pick up further strength, particularly towards the west. It'll be mostly dry, perhaps some drizzly bits and pieces over the southern uplands as well as Pennine districts before more rain arrives through the latter part of the night across northern England as well as Scotland. And again, that will push through quite quickly with that strong wind. It will be an exceptionally mild start to 2022. But we will again see some showers move in from the west, brighter skies ahead of it, and again that keen breeze with gales across western-facing coasts. All in all, temperatures will hold up in double figures away from the north. But as we head into Sunday, things turn very windy in the south and colder from the north. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
You're watching GB News live across the UK, the world, and our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We're here for you. Don't forget to join our community by hitting the subscribe button.
And download the GB News app so you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
I seem to spend my life sticking up for the billionaire Elon Musk, about to do so again, because he's rejected complaints that his satellites are taking up too much space in space after hundreds were launched into Earth's orbit with tens of thousands more planned. The head of the European Space Agency has called for coordinated action from the EU and other countries to ensure Musk's satellites did not litter near Earth orbit and indeed prevent others from launching their own satellites. But Musk, there he is, the headbanger, insisting that there is room for, quote, tens of billions of satellites in orbit around the Earth, saying that, quote, space is just extremely enormous and satellites are very tiny, unlike his ego. Andy Lound is a space expert, joins me now. Andy, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Where to begin? This sort of constellation of satellites that he's launching, it's internet related. Just explain what he's doing.
Yeah, what he's doing is he's launching off thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit, around about 210 miles above the surface of the Earth, essentially putting a ring of satellites in low Earth orbit, so you can actually communicate much more efficiently with ground people who need internet connections. I mean, that way you could actually connect vast areas of the Earth quite efficiently, really, by doing that. He's putting two sets of satellites up, those in about 210 miles above the surface of the Earth, and some others about 750 miles above the surface of the Earth. So he's got two systems operating there. So he's got two rings of satellites, constellations as they call them, ringing the Earth. So you can have, in theory, cheaper internet connections. I think if you log on, you'll find it's not quite as cheap as you expected. But you could actually cover vast areas of the Earth and probably have more efficient internet connections than you have sometimes at the moment, because, of course, it's much quicker to beam up and get a signal back down than it will be actually to go along the line of cables, perhaps running across the system. So that would be quite an efficient system to do. And that's what he's done. And he's got more to launch yet of these thousands of satellites. I think he's got about 1,700 operational at the moment, something like that. Quite fantastic quantity. But their position is causing controversy at the moment, especially with the Chinese.
They claim two near misses, don't they, with their still fairly recently launched space station. Were they complaining about, as you describe it, the satellites which were in low Earth orbit or the higher Earth orbit?
Yes. Yes.
Lower.
The Chinese space station orbits between 210 and 280 miles above the surface of the Earth, which means, of course, that they're crossing into the ring of satellites which are there. Whether or not they're in the exact same position is another argument, because if you've got these very small satellites and they're a tiny ring going around the Earth, Elon Musk says, well, there's plenty of space out there, and to shove all these things in, you could have billions of satellites. I mean, in theory, he's right. In practicality, he's not, because in theory you could put roads anywhere in the world and drive cars anywhere, because his argument was the number of cars that you have on the Earth, number of satellites in space. It doesn't work that way, because obviously you can't drive cars over mountains and you can't drive them through the oceans. So therefore you have to have a narrow band of where you can drive your cars. It's the same in space. For satellites to be practical, you need them in particular orbits, and that's so they can actually communicate with ground stations. So in reality, you can only put your satellites in a limited number of usable orbits, which of course changes the game plan then from the fact you can put billions up there to actually a few. And this is where the Chinese have actually complained, which is actually quite interesting. It's interesting the Chinese complaining about it, because they've often launched things without communicating with other people, and even brought stuff back down to the ground without controlled descent, which has caused controversy. So this is the pot calling the kettle black in some areas. But having said that, they have a good point. And it's something I've argued myself with various groups for many years and been laughed at for the fact that we need an international body, probably through the United Nations, of all the major space agencies, Europe, China, Britain, United States, Russia, all getting together around a table to organise a special committee which organise and control, to a certain degree, the regulations of launching things into space and putting them into orbit, because sooner or later we're going to have a really big disaster is going to take place.
You're ahead of the game. You're ahead of the game, aren't you? Was it a month ago, 6 weeks ago, the International Space Station, they had to make for the escape pods because the Russians blew up an old satellite, and there were bits of debris heading towards the space station.
Absolutely right. And then there needs to be proper international control now over this. I mean, I know a private company like Musk. I mean, I like Musk. Don't get me wrong here. I think Musk has done some fantastic things. He's put us probably 30 years ahead of the game now because of the way he's driven things, and he's been brilliant for that. But at the same time, he has to be tempered with responsibility for the international community and other nations who want to go into space as well, because there are a lot of new space players coming on the game now. India's going to be playing a major role in space. The Arab nations are getting together to launch vehicles too. So there's going to be a lot of people flying stuff into space, and there does need to be some level of organisation. I mean, it's like when airlines started. Airlines, sort of did willy-nilly, and then there had to be international controls to have air routes and to control it, and it works extremely well. It's very efficient, and people move along with it. And I think that's what we now need for the space, for space control this way. I think this is absolutely essential now, because otherwise we're going to have a real disaster on our hands. And that concerns me when you've got space stations like the ISS, you've got the Chinese, you've got the Russians planning to launch their own space station at some point, and Japan probably looking at doing something themselves in due course, and certainly India are. So you're going to have this clutter of people up there without any coordination. And it's like the motorways. You have to have rules on the motorways. Otherwise, I mean, you remember when the first M1 opened up, when they allowed you to go as fast as you like, the chaos that was breaking out. You had to have some sort of control. And we're not trying to curb back things. We just need a bit of common sense now to be applied into the game plan. Because Musk, to be honest, as a private company, is really, they say he's hogging the space lanes. To be honest, he's so far ahead of the game at the moment, his could be the only company that can do anything at some point, and he will be the one with the stuff up there dictating the terms. And I don't think the international community want that.
Andy, really nice to talk to you. Andy Lound. And
thank you very much.
Like the tree as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Restrictions in Northern Ireland are currently being reviewed at a remote executive meeting. This comes as tighter restrictions came into force from Boxing Day, including nightclub closures, recommendations to work from home where possible, and not mixing with more than 3 households. As of Wednesday, the number of positive cases confirmed in the past 7 days was just in excess of 30,883. Let's turn to our Northern Ireland reporter, Dougie Beattie, who joins us now, I hope. There he is. Hi, Dougie. Welcome to you.
Yes.
Hi. We've focused a lot recently on the situation in Scotland, perhaps eclipsing what's happening in Northern Ireland. What is the picture there?
Well, the executive meeting has just broken up within the last 10 or 15 minutes, and they've decided no further restrictions to be put in place. They will meet again on the 6th of January. That will come as a relief to a lot of parents who were afraid that there was going to be a circuit breaker in the education system, a lockdown, if you like. That wouldn't have went down well. And the business community in Northern Ireland, especially those in the hospitality sector, are very angry at the executive with how quickly the information got out to them about the Christmas closures and about the festivities. That money, of course, that they would have earned then would have brought them over the next 2 months. So basically, the executive, no change here. They have to meet again on the 6th of January.
And Dougie, just a quick one. Is that driven by the data? That old phrase, it'll be driven choices, decisions driven by the data. And if it is driven by the data, can you give us a general sense of how the numbers are looking, and in particular hospitalisations, because there seems to be a dawning realisation for a lot of people that actually cases can tell you one story, people actually being hospitalised sometimes tells another.
Yeah, well, I mean, the data is so confusing here, it's unbelievable. It's confusion across the whole of Britain. The data is telling us that there's a lot more Omicron in, it's a lot more quickly taken in by humans, but the hospitalisation isn't up there the same as it was with the Delta variant. So therefore, I think that they're as wise to let this go a little bit and see exactly where it goes. So for once, they might actually have took the advice from last week from business and said, please let this go, rather than the data.
Dougie Beattie, thanks ever so much. Thanks a lot. Coming up here on GB News, a royal expert telling us about Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction for sex trafficking and to what extent it spells trouble for Prince Andrew and the broader royal family. First, the news with Olivia.
Thank you, Colin. Here are the latest headlines. And on that Ghislaine Maxwell story, her family have launched an appeal after the British socialite was found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse girls. The 60-year-old has been convicted of 5 out of 6 charges in the US after a 3-week trial. Jurors found she lured young girls to be abused by Epstein between 1994 and 2004. The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs holding up to 100 patients each will start this week. Further sites could also be identified to add a further 4,000 super surge beds. The Liverpool Women's Hospital bomber died from the explosion and fire caused by the improvised device he made with murderous intent, a coroner has ruled. Iraqi-born Ahmed al-Swilmin was killed when his bomb went off with him inside the taxi. The driver, David Perry, survived the blast. The coroner said it remained unclear as to whether he intended for the device to detonate when it did. The average UK house price is now 16% higher than before the pandemic. The typical price of a home reached a record high of almost £255,000 in December. That's an increase of just under £24,000 in a year. The Nationwide Building Society says it's the biggest increase ever recorded in a single year. Wales saw the greatest increase, with house prices up on average by 15.8%. You're right up to date. I'll be back with more on today's news at the top of the hour.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. At that time of the year when lots of individuals, organisations too, use the end of the year to make a point. The Trades Union Congress is one of those organisations. It's calling on the government to give workers a pay rise for 2022, which some economists have labelled the year of the squeeze. The TUC claims that real wages, the level of wages minus inflation, will rise by 0.6% between now and 2026. That is not enough, they'll say, to offset the effects of the cost of living, which is rising sharply. The government insists that real wages have grown since the start of the pandemic and are 3.4% above pre-pandemic levels, and that more is already being done to make the pinch of 2022 less damaging. Let's turn to the trades unionist, the writer and GB News contributor, Paul Embry, who joins us now to ponder on this one. Hi to you, Paul. If you were drafting this from the TUC, would you be broadly in line with what they said? Would you be going off on a tangent saying something totally different?
No, I am broadly in line with it. I think it makes some really pertinent points, not least, as you mentioned, Colin, the fact that real wages are less than they were pre the financial crash in 2008. You also need to look at the rising cost of living, the fact that energy bills are likely to get even higher, the impact of the cut in universal credit for many families, the hike in national insurance as well. And, I think the TUC is right to say that what we need to be looking to deliver are what are called fair pay agreements. They have them in New Zealand. The trade union movement in Britain has been agitating for them here, where you effectively have an agreement between government employers and unions across each sector. So you have a sector-wide agreed rate of pay. That, alongside an increase in the minimum wage itself, I think will help put money into people's pockets, will help to improve people's living standards, and actually will have the knock-on effect of helping to grow the economy, which is something we've been trying to do for the last decade without much success, have we?
Yeah. Paul, what do you say to those people who channel Margaret Thatcher, who say you can't buck the market, and actually the market will offer its own corrections here? And if you look at something, I don't know, like tanker drivers, some of those pretty wacky salary increases that were being offered by some of the supermarket chains and the oil companies to get drivers, to lure drivers into their cabs out of other people's, that was the market in action, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I, as a passionate trade unionist, believe in a flourishing private sector. I believe that there must be markets, but it's important also that that's combined with the ability of the government to be able to intervene, to set minimum standards. I'm not a Thatcherite at all, in the sense of, we just roll back the frontiers of the state. We allow the market to dominate. We privatise everything. I think that kind of 80s agenda left a legacy of underfunded public services, of high unemployment, of a lack of competitiveness. So, the important thing, I think, is to combine the dynamism and the innovation of the market with the right legislation and strong trade unions who can step in where the market is failing. And you only have to look really at the crash, Colin, in 2008 to realise that the market doesn't have all the answers. The market isn't infallible. And on that occasion, the market could not correct what it had created. And it was up to governments to intervene to try to clear up the mess. And I think that should be the vision for any sensible modern economy going forward.
Paul, just a brief thought, and unfortunately, because it's a big topic, it's around demography. I was talking to a demographer we had in the studio recently, one of the leading demographers in this country, and he makes the point to anybody who'll listen that the trades union movement, business, journalists, everybody needs to wake up quickly to an emerging reality in this country, which is, and you're starting to see it, he says, in taking the tanker drivers as an example. I had somebody on earlier just talking about the shortage of teachers. Before that, this morning, somebody talking about the shortage of nurses. Wake up to the fact, says this demographer, that we're just not having enough people to enter the workforce in this country. Yes, there's a baby boomer cohort moving through. They're not being replaced.
Well, I think there's all sorts of variables to look at. I mean, I think one thing that has created the situation that we're seeing in some of those sectors that you're talking about is the oversupply of labour from the European Union that we relied on for years and years in this country, and which, as a result of creating downward pressure on wages, when all of a sudden those sectors were denuded of that labour, it started to show how a tighter labour market could lead to rising wages. So I think managing the economy is as much about ensuring that there isn't an oversupply as ensuring that there isn't an undersupply. And my view is that workers have got the right to demand pay increases. I mean, it seems to me that the same people who argue that the market should do its job and we should allow the invisible hand of the market to work are the first people to say, well, when workers demand their market value for their job as a result of a tight labour market, then those wage demands are irresponsible and they could create inflation. So yeah, you have to balance these things, and it's important that workers get what they're entitled to. And the demands that we're seeing recently, I think, are entirely justified.
Paul, nice talking to you. Thanks a lot. Now, the list of housing, here it comes, cold spots, not hot spots, cold spots, has been released today. These are the areas with the lowest growth in average house prices this year. If the graphics machine is working, we'll show you what that list looks. Oh, there you go. It works. So this is the places which have topped the list and how much the house prices fell on average. Central London, a lot of investors from abroad not piling in, they're piling out. I'm slightly more curious about why Airdrie's been quite so struck by falling prices. Hammersmith and Fulham, West London, that falls into the Central London bracket, with foreign investors in particular fleeing the capital. But again, Coatbridge in Scotland, minus 2.3. Compare that, if you would, to the hotspots. There's no hotter hotspot than Taunton. The largest hotspot, prices increased there by 21.8%. It's quite a figure, isn't it? James Forrester is the Managing Director at Barrows and Forrester Estate Agents in Walsall. It's nice of you to join us. Appreciate your time today. Thanks very much indeed. We could understand, just on those cold spots, we get what's happening in central London, and that which goes up so quickly occasionally comes down so quickly. So you get these massive undulations in central London, big money. But in the other places that are cold spots, especially in parts of Scotland, any guess as to what's happening there?
Well, a lot of it's publicity. I think what's been happening in 2021, what we're seeing is London and Scotland have really taken up, over 50% of the top 20 according to Halifax. And when you're getting a lot of bad publicity about places being closed, hospitality being hit, don't come into the centres, then we are going to see a lack of foreign investment coming in. And when you do see a lack of investment coming in, then naturally it does hit the house prices. And that's exactly what we're starting to see with Scotland and London. That they've done very well in previous years, but we're now starting to see it starting to lag behind other great areas that we're starting to see, especially in England, which is really starting to boom in other areas like the West Midlands. And as you said, Taunton, 21.8% is absolutely unbelievable. But it's a supply and demand model, and that's what we're starting to see.
James, what's it been like in your office this year? I mean, obviously, just setting aside the patchy bits of the picture, if you look at the overall national picture and you average out, we were reporting earlier today, I think it's 16% that house prices have risen since the beginning of the pandemic. For the year just gone, it's pretty much the biggest increase in any single year. I mean, is it giddy times for estate agents? Is it the phone ringing off the hook? What's going on?
I wish. It's interesting times at the moment. So even though house prices are doing really well, for estate agents, a lot of us are worried because it's the lifeblood of our agencies. Obviously, of course, is listings, people selling their houses, and what we are seeing is a major shortage across the UK. I think an average estate agent at the moment has 11 listings on their books, which is very little going into it. So it is a bit of a worry. I think there's a lot of nervousness in the market of should people sell. They want to know what's going on. They want to know what restrictions are going on. Is it right? But this is the best time to sell your property if you want to get more bang for your buck. So if you want to sell and if you're sat watching this and you're thinking of selling your property, ring your local estate agent, get it on the market. It will be gone within a record time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the old story, though, isn't it? If you're taking your money out of the market, that works. If you're then using the money you've accrued to buy somewhere else, you're selling high, but you're buying high as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to look, what you're selling for. There's obviously different models of why you're selling it. You could be an investor with a buy-to-let, and you obviously want to sell that. But if you're selling it because you want to move your family, then you have to look at it. Is it job reasons that you're moving to a different part of the country, that you have to sell? Is it because you've outgrown your current house, especially through all the lockdowns? I think there's a lot of people have realised that houses are a little bit too small and they actually want more outdoor space. So we're seeing a lot of people move out into the countrysides a little bit more. And at the same point, we've had a lot of divorces go through. So, of course, people are, deciding that they need to go in their own separate ways. And this is the difference that we are starting to see. But I'm a big believer of assess the masses and do the opposite. And if you want to get more money for your house, then this is the best time to sell it at the moment. Borrowing is at an all-time low. I believe we have just had an interest rate rise, and I do believe in 2022 we'll see more of these. But if you really want to get more for your money, then absolutely this is the time to get your house in the market and to get it sold, regardless of the region that you may be in.
Forrester, appreciate your time today. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Let's take you back to our main story today, and that is the story from the States, the news from the States, that Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted of grooming teenagers, effectively for abuse, by Jeffrey Epstein. Let's turn to the editor-in-chief of Majesty magazine, that's Ingrid Seward, to reflect on what, if anything, this means for the institution of monarchy and obviously for Prince Andrew particularly. Ingrid Seward, welcome to you. Thanks for your time. It's an imponderable, this one, isn't it? I mean, he's been keeping a low profile. We had Angela Levin in here, the royal writer, yesterday, who was saying he needs to keep a low profile, Prince Andrew, pretty much for the rest of his life. There's a question about how achievable that is. Obviously not very desirable for him, but do you think events in America really move on that equation very much?
I think people are so shocked by the revelations of some of these very brave women have stood up and given in court that I think it's quite hard to take in that there is this British woman, Ghislaine, who's 60, and she's going to be in prison for the rest of her life and she hasn't actually murdered anyone, but she's trafficked these teenage girls, and it's really shocking. And I think that obviously the Duke of York, however innocent or not he might be, he is tainted by what happens to Ghislaine. So he is now, or was, a close friend of a woman who was, at the time of their friendship, trafficking teenage girls for her lover, who was also a friend of Andrew's. And I think the public at large think, well, does this man have any sense of judgment whatsoever, that he actually spends time with these people? Not only does he spend time with them, but he invites them to his mother's Balmoral estate, and he invites them on a shooting weekend at Sandringham. So, he is using his mother's property, not property of the government because they're private homes, but he's using his mother's property to entertain the paedophile and his accomplice. I think that's what shocks people.
Mm. And we keep being shown, I should say, that picture again and again and again. Ghislaine Maxwell, Prince Andrew, and one of the alleged victims. And, however complicated the court case is, those images, there's a toll, a public relations toll, if I can put it as bluntly as that. I just wonder, Ingrid, whether you feel, therefore, regardless of what happens to any appeal, regardless of the extent to which Prince Andrew is dragged into this this legal morass any more than he already has been, whether you feel he is so tarnished that he can actually disappear from view, should disappear from view, and whether that's even possible.
It's very interesting, that, Colin. I don't know. I mean, I think people's memories are short, but I think that ideally for Prince Andrew, probably, maybe he could go and live abroad. I mean, he is very tarnished here. And, you look at the monarchy, and next year we're going to be seeing, all his siblings, if you like, helping his mother, the Queen, but he won't be able to be there. And I just cannot imagine what he's going to do with his life. And people won't forget, but it will drop out of their main memory bank. And I suppose he could, I think personally that he would have to go and live somewhere else, and and start a new life. I mean, other people have done it. There is no reason why he couldn't think about it. But of course, the logistics of it are very difficult if you're, a member of the royal family. But I don't think he can come back into the royal world. Certainly not for the foreseeable future, anyway.
Ingrid Seward, Editor-in-Chief of Majesty Magazine. Ingrid, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Let us know your thoughts on that story. Didn't have time to talk to Ingrid as we did yesterday to Angela Levin about the Queen's speech, which was a quite remarkable piece of oratory from the monarch, and perhaps reflecting a number of issues that will swirl around the monarchy, certainly through the course of next year, the Platinum Jubilee for the Queen, of course. Ingrid Seward joining us there. Coming up next, though, it's the political correction Christmas, reflecting on the political year that's been, all the ups and downs, the turmoil, the good times, the bad. That's coming up next here on GB News.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there. As we approach a New Year's Eve, things look decidedly mild. Wet for some and a fair amount of cloud, but today we've seen some favoured spots, seeing summer brighter weather. But this weather front straddles more central parts of the country, moving slowly northwards, bringing with it some high rainfall totals as we head into a New Year's Eve. And you can see it's rather windy across many parts of the country. So through Thursday evening and overnight, you can see this rain moving up towards northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts to come. And we will see the highest rainfall totals for the Lake District, as well as Dumfries and Galloway. Further south, more rain returns to Wales as well as the West Country. By dawn tomorrow, we'll be across central southern England, pushing quite quickly towards the southeast, as well as the Midlands and East Anglia. It's a mild night, leading into a mild start to New Year's Eve. Through the day then tomorrow, we'll see this rain just stall across central and southern parts of Scotland, as well as northern England. It will dry up across Northern Ireland, even some brighter skies further south across England and Wales, as well as the far northeast of Scotland. And even where we see this rain, it will fade as we head through into evening time. So if you are stepping out through a New Year's Eve evening, It's worth noting the winds will pick up further strength, particularly towards the west. It'll be mostly dry, perhaps some drizzly bits and pieces over the southern uplands as well as Pennine districts before more rain arrives through the latter part of the night across northern England as well as Scotland. And again, that will push through quite quickly with that strong wind. It will be an exceptionally mild start to 2022. But we will again see some showers move in from the west, brighter skies ahead of it, and again that keen breeze with gales across western facing coasts. All in all, temperatures will hold up in double figures away from the north. But as we head into Sunday, things turn very windy in the south and colder from the north. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News Live